This program is made possible primarily with support from the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, also with support from the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, and personal donations, mostly from Sue Hansel and Polly Cleveland. I wanted to say basically, I talked to John Kelly and some others, and this is basically a response by progressive Georgists to the Green New Deal, and we'll be putting together a response by conservative Georgists to the Green New Deal sometime soon, but we haven't scheduled it yet. And I want to turn it over to Ed Dotson, who has set this up and will introduce all of the other participants. Ed is a longtime Georgist and a former official with Fannie Mae. And take it away, Ed.
All right, Dan, thanks a lot. Basically, look, we thought it would be an excellent topic for discussion because we live in a world that's undergoing tremendous change, and the pace of change is enormous. We have enormous challenges with regard to the environment, with our political organization, with challenges of economic growth and stability. Poverty still remains an enormous problem, along with population growth in some countries. That's really making it difficult for people to find a living or even meet basic needs. Followers of Henry George have always had diverse opinions about how best to make changes in society and the role of government. How much government should we have? What should the functions of government be? What's the best way to achieve a full employment society? And now dealing with the many issues that I've just described. You know, what we want is a clean environment. We want people to have a high standard of living, to have enough, but there are challenges to achieving this. And so the three people that I've been invited, recruited to participate in the discussion, each have a great deal of world experience, lifetime experience, in trying to really change the course of history in our own way. Our first speaker, Marty Rowland, has a long history in the planning community. He has very specific ideas about how to best get us to a society that's stable and is also able to perform in a sustainable way to achieve the goals that I talked about. Alanna Hartzok, twice a candidate for the U.S. Congress, once as a Green Party candidate, once as a candidate for the Democratic Party. She has worked with the United Nations on behalf of the International Union for Land Value Taxation for many years, and has been very active in her local community and in other communities, trying to get politicians to listen to the logic of why they should move to a two-rate property tax. And Dave Wetzel is basically, I think I'm correct in saying this, Dave, inherited some of his beliefs from his father. He's been a long-time activist in the UK. For most of his political life, he was involved with the Labour Party, served in the Labour Party's government in London. He was a key figure in the implementation of congestion pricing in London to try to deal with the traffic problems in that city. And in recent years, he has moved over to join with the Greens in the UK. So he brings that real interesting perspective of his political life with his practical experience in helping to deal with some of these problems in London. And we'll hear from Dave last but not least. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marty. He's going to share the screen. He has a PowerPoint to share with us. We'll go with each presentation about 25 minutes, take a couple questions, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A function, and we're asking that you raise questions of clarification only. Tomorrow we will have a roundtable where I'll bring all three of our presenters back together, put questions to them, And tomorrow you can really put hard questions to them in terms of what you found agreeable or disagreeable in their presentations and your own perspectives. So, Marty.
They're up to ask if this is being recorded.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sessions are being recorded and will be available eventually for anyone to review later.
Good. So let me bring my screen up. There we go. So you can see it. Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to the panel on the Green New Deal. My name is Marty Rowland, and thanks, Ed, for the introduction. The way I'm going to do this today is just let everybody know that if they want a copy of the paper that I wrote for these slides, you just need to go on to the academia.edu site and put in my name, Marty Rowland, and it'll come up. I don't have it in there yet, but I'm going to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the abstract to the paper, because I think it gives a good overview of what I'm about to say. And then I'm going to go into about 16 slides. So that should get me to where I need to be in 20 minutes. So the abstract. So the talk that I'm giving, well, the paper is called Endogenous Resilience, and maybe just to give you a snapshot of what endogenous resilience means. If you see New York City, for example, with all the expenses for coronavirus, all the expenses for the police during the riots, if a land value tax, for example, were part of the revenue generation system, and all that revenue from land value were sufficient to cover those emergency things, that would be an example of endogenous resilience, so that you didn't need the federal government extra money. So let me read the abstract, then I'll go into the slides. This paper was written for a conference on the panel for the Green New Deal, as promoted by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. While the aspirational sentiment behind the proposal is commendable, the historical, economical, and environmental foundation for such a program is misguided. Rather, a more appropriate precedent for a jobs-creating, planet-centric public works program should use the Moon program of the 1960s as a model, although that program shared elements with the Depression-era original New Deal. As this panel is being held within the conference of the Council for Georgist Organizations, it's appropriate to reflect on the 140 years of trial capturing land values to correct social maladjustments that has mostly ended in error, with notable exceptions. This paper suggests that land value taxation must continue to be our goal, but that it should be couched within the context of concurrent fostering of technological advance and wealth creation that are likewise socially created. And that's what I call endogenous resiliency. So let me go to the first slide. Okay, so I've got these 7 points that I'm going to be covering. What is endogenous resilience, the origin of the Green New Deal, lessons from the original New Deal, the Moon program is a better template, infrastructure banking is something to talk about, then standard for infrastructure management, because I think that gets into the micro level of what we're talking about. And then recent legislation that supports all this that just happened in May 19th. Oop. So what is endogenous resilience? So if you take the two words apart, endogenous means has an internal cause or origin. And that's what I see as being reflected in the land value taxation, endogenous. Resilience, capacity to recover quickly from difficulty. So we can see that being an element somewhat related to sustainability, but it's more of a factor of infrastructure management and coverage, I suppose. So this is an important figure. I'm going to talk about it briefly and then move on. But if you read Progress and Poverty, you can't help but stumble over this diagram. It's highly simplified, of course, but essentially 3 factors of production that we all know about: creating wealth, and then the choice of whether the land rent should go to the landowner or to society. And in this diagram, it shows that it's going to society as rent. And then that's the private economy. And then you got a separate public economy that Henry George often talks about when he talks about solving the social maladjustments. And he lists out 20 or so in the book about security and healthcare and education, streets and roads and those kind of things. So there's a public economy rent that likewise that's generated, and with all that rent going back to the public economy to pay for capital improvements and the operation maintenance, then that's what the diagram talks about. So the origins of the Green New Deal. There's 2 people that have been identified as the origins of this idea: Thomas Friedman, author and commentator, and then Richard Murphy, who's a tax scholar from the UK in 2007. I think AOC said both of those people were not getting into something that's as comprehensive. So the 3 elements of the New Deal that we were talking about, the one that Ocasio-Cortez talks about, starts out with the idea of decarbonization of society. And this is probably the most instructive slide in my stack here, because it talks about what the challenge really is. And for climate change purposes, it's important for our society to decarbonize. But let's look at the numbers of the energy. We have it in terms of billions of kilowatt hours, and you go from 1949 to 2011, where we went from 296 to over 4,000. And you see that the percentage of fossil fuels stayed the same, even though we drastically increased the amount of energy that we create. And this is for electrification. And of course, in 1949, there really wasn't any nuclear power. Now we're at 19.2%. Conventional hydropower, 32, went down to 9 because, or 8, because we didn't add any additional since, say, like the Hoover Dam and some of the other electropower. And then the most important thing is the renewables, from 0 to 8%. So this is the challenge that we're all talking about. If we're talking about a Green New Deal, we're saying we're at 8% now. And what would be the impact on society if we went up to 40%, for example? Would that make a change in the climate change emissions? And what would be the effect on the economy? So that's an important point that I suspect that we're going to be coming back to this diagram, because it kind of puts the challenge in perspective. The second part of the bill that Ocasio-Cortez has talks about jobs, and this is going from dirty jobs to clean jobs. And you can see some of the jobs that are referenced, working on wind turbines, installation of PV panels. And then the transition is that retraining and redefining the workplace. So if we're having coal miners, for example, they might need to be retrained and maybe the workplace redefined. The next slide goes into the lessons of the original New Deal, and this is where I say that some of the impressions of what the New Deal was all about might be misunderstood in terms of trying to fashion the Green New Deal around what this one was, because it's kind of implied that the old New Deal was say a government giveaway program where a lot of money and a lot of opportunities were missed, but rather the New Deal was really about infusing money to private operations, private sector. For example, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is an agency that was borrowed from the Hoover administration. Jesse Jones, which you see here on the right-hand side of the slide, was ahead of that, and he came from the Texas Commerce Bank to head up a lot of the activities and saw it through. One of the first things he did was create the Federal Housing Administration, and in that he picked a guy named James Moffett from Standard Oil of New Jersey and employees from the National City Bank. What they did was create an insurance pool that allowed a lot of mortgages to be issued. And I think we'll probably get some comments about the racial discrimination that was involved in the early program with redlining, but that's well, it's kind of beside the point of what I'm trying to say, but it's an important factor in how everything was created. So that was a federal agency, put a lot of people in homes, created a lot of jobs. Then the Defense Plant Corporation, that was a job where they picked an engineer and consultant from the Philadelphia Public Works Department, a guy named Morris Cook. He was involved in that, and that's where they created a lot of manufacturing jobs and owned the defense plants, but allowed the private sector to go in and depreciate a lot of the equipment. So after the war, there was a lot of infrastructure and manufacturing space that could be used for the economy. Just a note, I used to work at the MISU assembly facility in New Orleans, where they built plywood airplanes for the war, and then afterwards was involved in the Apollo program in the 60s and Space Shuttle. So I'm familiar with that whole operation. Rural electrification was an important program, and that was taking electrical wires out to the farm and the rural areas. One of the important things was working with rural cooperatives, where his attitude, the Morris Cook, was involved in that, talking about that it was actually the utilities that failed. It wasn't capitalism. So what they did was have 20-year loans at low interest rates, and they had 5-year loan programs. So they're always involving the private sector to do the things that the private sector was risk averse, and they didn't want to invest their own money. So it's kind of like a prodding. So business overcame their risk aversion. So what I'm thinking is that the Moon program is actually a better program that should be modeled for whatever we do. So I guess I'm not claiming that we should call for a Green New Deal program, but essentially have the benefits of an environmental focus, social justice focus, but doing it through like the model of the Moon program. So if we go back in time far enough to the early days of the United States, Hamilton's First National Bank was an example of a credit creation theory of banking, where the continental debts and the war debts from the Revolutionary War were capitalized, put into the bank, and loans given out for internal improvements, where you had 10 times the value of the reserves being loaned out, which is exactly the way that a public bank works, much like the national or the Bank of North Dakota would be an example. The next one was Lincoln's Greenbacks program, and if you read the story behind that, essentially it's $450 million that was printed, which essentially saved the war for the Union, because even the Confederates were printing money, but the difference was that they had legal tender with the greenbacks, and that was essentially doing the same kind of things as infusing money into the system, paying the soldiers, paying for supplies, and it was largely credited for why the North, why they won. And then it was into the Sputnik era, where you had Eisenhower and Kennedy putting together programs for putting money into NASA. The value was, I think it was 280 billion was what was eventually spent in that 13-year effort. But we all know about the 1970s, 80s, personal computer spin-offs. You see Steve Jobs here on the right, and the idea that $7 was generated for every dollar spent. So this is one of those things where government money spent wisely to encourage the private sector to do the kind of things that the population wants to see. Then the last thing, which I think is the better template, and I'm going to be getting into this this idea in the next few slides. You see the surface of the moon on the right, and the idea of mining helium-3, which some people might know is a component of a future a nuclear fusion effort. And it's got the interest of countries like China and India, for example. Oh, so the next slide I got here was the idea of, well, what would be a better approach than, let's say, a Green New Deal as it's been proposed by Ocasio-Cortez? Well, I'm saying that if you take the United States and you create development corridors, let's say starting from Philadelphia, and then go into this ring in the old Rust Belt that combines Pittsburgh with Cleveland and Chicago and St. Louis and Cincinnati, and develop that area as a place for manufacturing and high technology, and using high-speed rail between there, and maybe materials transport either on the same tracks or something separate, but idea. So the idea behind this one is capitalizing the bank on the land values that are primarily underneath the railway or at the nodes where you have stations or where people get off, and population centers.
Marty, Ed here. Believe it or not, you only have 5 minutes left.
Oh, sure. I'm on the last couple slides, so everything is going to come together here. So I appreciate that. So that's the ring that I'm thinking that is a way to go forward. And we all know that the original railroads, the transcontinental, the land was given away to the private interests, and they went sometimes 20 miles out from the railroad, which was a lost opportunity for land value capture. Just a little showing a closer view of this. You see, for example, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, with the idea of capturing along the way and at the nodes. So the idea would be to acquire the land at centers and along the way, and lease the revenue to finance the bank. And of course, the trick is to capture that land. And so maybe in the discussion, I could describe how I think it could be pulled together. And then if we are successful with that, or maybe even parallel to that, would be an infrastructure bank that would be more international, where you have a lot of nations now interested in exploring the moon specifically. I call it an extraterrestrial infrastructure bank, where we'd renegotiate outer space treaties and set lease prices per square meter for mining and exploration, and especially if you look at the potential benefit of the helium-3 mining and the possibility of creating an energy source that would be replacing a lot of the dirty fossil fuels, that might be the way to go. And also the revenue to finance the bank would be from the leasing, and you could finance startup tech firms and disadvantaged community firms. But the idea is, rather than leaving it up for chance or international conflict, that we could start out right off the bat and use a Georgist system for the infrastructure banks. And of course, we could always do this right now and look at electromagnetic spectrum and geosynchronous orbit leasing, but that's just something that could be added to the mix. The last, second to the last slide has to do with the infrastructure management, and this is something that can be done right now. There's a ASTM standard that I authored with several others that talks about public engagement. We talk about policing, for example, healthcare with the COVID. If communities would use the standard, they could have both transparency and accountability using benchmarks and metrics. And there's always that opportunity that somebody in the back of the room could say, have you thought about land value taxation to pay for that which you say there's no money for that? And this is another thing we might talk about. The whole idea about exogenous and endogenous wealth flows comes from this diagram. And since because of the time I have, I'll just say that what I show here is revenues and outlays, and the E is the land value taxation that goes to not only pay for operations and maintenance of all the infrastructure systems that society has, but money could be raised from land value taxation for the capital improvements. And I'll just save that for later. And then I'll end this with recent legislation. Senator Schumer was talking about this Endless Frontiers Act, offering $100 billion for a lot of the things that I just mentioned here about domestic manufacturing, national defense, environmental protection, education, workforce development, transportation. And you see this photo on the right, which is additive manufacturing, which is something that's being used by SpaceX and other high-tech firms. So that's my approach. I call this endogenous resiliency because it's something that I think can be folded very well into a Georgist way of looking at the economy, both privately and publicly. So I'm ready for any questions. That's all I had.
Well, Marty, you did a great job. It's a lot of technical information. I've been making a good many notes. Maybe others have as well. But no one has raised any question to you requiring clarification. So we'll wait until the general discussion to see what else comes up. But,
Okay.
but give us a lot to think about, a lot of very serious proposals and analysis. So thanks for a great job. I appreciate it.
So I'll stop sharing this. Okay, there we go.
Okay. And we now will ask Alanna to join us. She has a PowerPoint and a few slides as well. So Alanna, the screen's all yours. As soon as you take it.
You have to unmute your mic, Alanna.
Yeah, I see your. Oh, let me mute mine.
Okay. I decided not to do an entire PowerPoint. I just want to connect some dots for us, and then I do have a PowerPoint slide that I think puts a whole lot together. So we'll spend at least, if you can give me at least 5 minutes there at the end, Ed, to make sure we get that slide on. So having looked at both the AOC Cortez Green New Deal proposal, federal level, and also at local Green Party, Baltimore Green Party, what I see as tremendous value of the federal proposal is that it's putting together a very complete, holistic, triple bottom line wish list, if you will, for environment, social justice, addressing gross problem of economic inequality, of course, need for good jobs, and so forth. So it's generated a momentum of interest and a focus. I don't have any high hopes that it will be passed on the federal level. My hope lies that it will be inspiration for local and regional efforts. I think the federal government of the United States is too divided, and I don't see that ending. The weakness of that Green New Deal is that there is not much clarity regarding how is it going to be paid for, the financing of it. And I don't think we'd be surprised at that. Thus, it looks very left, it looks very socialist, it looks very big government bureaucratic. And it doesn't look like there's much in it for local power, a small business, free, fair markets. So because of that, even though the vision is clear and potentially quite unifying, I don't see that it's going to be able to move forward effectively. That's where we as Georgists come in, where we have clarity around policies that are beyond old right and old left, if you will. Now, because there's a holistic understanding that's growing, I think that it's going to be very helpful for us. And let me say what I mean, how broad that holistic understanding is. Say a recent interview with Dr. Zach Bush with Del Bigtree, tremendously informative, inspiring. Dr. Bush is a triple board certified medical doctor who's worked both with hospice and with the birthing, both the birth and the death end. And he's extremely knowledgeable about bacteria, viruses, the immune system, and a beautiful vision for a possible society. Now, guess what he's now strongly into, which is regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture. Food is so important for any progress forward, and our food supply, because of the lack of purchasing capacity, because of the chemical inputs of agribusiness, is not creating health. 43% of our population in the United States is food insecure. I mean, 43 million people, not 43%, 43 million people are food insecure. Georgists have also written, even decades ago, we've had medical doctor Georgists who've written books on how wealth inequality causes stress, and stress, of course, negatively impacts our health. So the negative impacts of health have contributed to those who are dying of COVID. Holistic doctors understand it is the field. It is the areas of the highest pollution, the poorest nutrition, and the poverty where there is the greatest mortality from COVID. So the understanding that they have that health is caused, that the diseases, infectious diseases, smallpox, polio, the curve was going down before the vaccines were created and put out. And the reason the curves of mortality for smallpox, polio, and other infectious diseases were going down was because of vast improvements in sanitation, sewage, water, and all that a city properly provides for the people. Now, back again, how do you finance the sanitation? And we know that the socially created value of the land is a sufficient fund to finance sanitation. Without this, you can throw federal money, subsidies into a city for various things that a city needs, and you will see an increase in the land value, thus ever increasing lack of affordable housing, as the purchasing capacity of labor cannot keep up with the price of the land value and hence the price of housing. So many dots to connect from a holistic understanding of social problems, societal needs, and how to finance the kind of world that we want. Going back to this issue of recycling the community-created land rent back to pay for what the people need, and even in very expensive cities like New York, London, and so on, surely a portion to go to direct dividend checks to those living there as a further income earned. They're not earning it through wages, but they're earning it by right of existence on the earth. And this is where we look at the commons understanding in our state of Alaska. The Constitution states that the resources belong to the people of Alaska. And that led the state government to put in place the permanent fund to collect the oil resource rent and the distribution of those funds in part for citizen dividends, anywhere from $800 to $1,000 up to $1,800. It's been dollars per annum per each resident of Alaska, which has been a great assistance to mitigating the wealth inequality there. So with the fairness of the properly structured market economy, we can rally both Greens that are often very leftist now. They used to be neither right nor left, but up in front. But you'll be hard to find a Green or Green Party person that sees the marvelous incentives that the market that we can create for the market, for freedom, for free enterprise, when it is properly constructed, properly incentivized, and having a proper balance between what is yours, what's mine, and what's ours, a proper balance between the private sector and the public sector. And that balance comes from understanding the power of taxation, which the Green New Deal doesn't, and leftist Green Party people don't. Most right people on the right don't either. Their dividing line between right and left is a big government or small government. Continually arguing big government, small government, and you have such a blockage there. And to whose advantage is that blockage? It's to those who maintain the current status quo. It's to the 1% that has tremendous power through their financial capacity. And this is really what we're up against. I'm going to, at the end now, present that, not quite yet, but in a few minutes, a green tax shift diagram. And certainly Marty's ideas, we have brilliant ideas, but you know, it does come down to power. How are we going to build the power beyond the right and left when we're still so divided? there is surely an understanding of how we can bring together the Republicans, the conservative Republicans, and I just watched Rick Wilson, who was a strong Republican strategist to help get, he says, 2,000 Republicans elected and Republicans in 38 state governments. He's now started an anti-Trump website, and he's all about get Trump out no matter how. And he wants to also save the Democrats from themselves. So we're seeing now a tremendous search from those right and left to come together to find a new understanding. I'm from and I moved back home to a conservative Republican, fairly fundamentalist Christian rural Pennsylvania area. The largest town is Chambersburg, is 20,000. But guess what? They have for decades, maybe a century, all the public utilities in the town of Chambersburg are publicly owned. They are run on a no profit, no loss basis. And it is the only municipality in the state of Pennsylvania doing so. This is also a Georgist policy that you socialize needed utilities or monopolies. You socialize natural monopolies on the most decentralized level feasible. Back again quickly to an issue that I see in terms of power that's going to be coming up, and you may think it's a little off topic, but I just wanted to mention it. The big money that distorted Georgia's economics, that brought in neoliberal economics by funding Columbia University, University of Chicago, other schools of economics, whereby the three-factor economics of land, labor, capital became two-factor, as we had land denoting all of the gifts of nature, the earth itself become a subset of capital. These same forces, I'm talking about original Rockefeller money and so on, funded the American Medical Association, and big pharmaceutical has come out of there. Now there's a big battle with holistic doctors and many who are understanding that our medical system has become so extremely for profit that it's dangerous, that the third cause of death is forms of the medical malpractice, bad recommendations for medicine, and the dramatically increasing numbers of autistic children and chronic disease coming out of unregulated, untested vaccines that the pharmaceutical companies are totally exempt from any liability for the damages caused by the vaccines. Now the big push is coming up that we have to all get vaccinated against COVID. And this is going to be a big power battle. And I think as much as Georgia's, we can connect the dots around the power problem and economic inequality and the land problem and the health issues, the better we're going to, the faster we're going to move ahead into the public dialogue. So I'm going to just, how's my time, Ed? He has to unmute to answer that. I'm going to go to my.
You're doing fine, Alanna. You have another 10 minutes at least.
Okay. So tell me when the slides are up. Are you able to see this slide?
Nothing yet.
What do I have to do? I have to do something, don't I? You have to give me.
After you hit share screen, it will give you all the things that are up on your screen, and you have to select one of them.
All right, I have to hit share screen, right?
Yeah.
Right. And then select the one.
Right, I should know this. I do it with other organizations. Okay, I hit share screen. And then I go back to my PowerPoint. I have to exit full screen.
Did you highlight your PowerPoint on the share screen when?
There it
Okay.
is.
Is it there?
It's coming
Okay.
up.
Okay, well, while it's coming up and for a minute now, I wanted to talk a little bit more about food and agriculture. I already mentioned that 43 million people in the United States are food insecure. The poor quality of our food is grown by chemical agriculture. And depleted soils means that the micronutrients, the microorganisms that feed the soil, that feed the plants, that feed us, are not available anymore. They have been destroyed through chemical agriculture, large-scale agriculture, consolidated monopoly, land monopoly agriculture. So we need to address the land problem if we're going to have healthy food. And what we're being shown by COVID is that the distribution lines can be disrupted, as in the closure of some of the meat processing plants, which led to some meat shortages. There were places where their shelves were not readily supplying our food. Grocery stores only have about a week of food in their pipeline to give us. So this is a serious problem when food is transported 1,000, 2,000 miles away. And most regions, most areas in the world can be highly food self-reliant if we have the economy structured appropriately and fairly and for the right incentives. Some of you may have heard of the RIGHT Act in California, when a school teacher who understood land value tax in the late 1800s got elected to the state legislature, put in legislation that said local irrigation districts could be formed and they would be paid for by the increase in land value. In the Modesto-Turlock region of the Central Valley of California, where one man, Mr. Miller, owned about 1 million acres of poor ranch land. With the increase in the land value, with the irrigation systems put in place, because the bonds were raised, monies were raised, people bought the bonds, there was money paid for the infrastructure, then the payback for the cost of the infrastructure was from the increase in land value. This created a land reform where 7,000 small farmers were able to get access, affordable access to land. We have seen through the work of Mason Gaffney primarily and others, that when a tax is taken off of a farmer's buildings and labor and placed on the land value, that this is of great benefit to smaller farmers. Like my state of Pennsylvania, in my area, still has a lot of small farms, 150, 200 acres, up against corporate agriculture of thousands of acres of monocropping. So again, to look at decentralized, self-sufficient, highly self-reliant economies, where I think we can be effective in the tax shift, let's appeal to farmers, small farmers. Let's appeal to local businesses who would like to increase and make the housing supply, improve the housing supply, and all these benefits of the tax shift to the basic needs, supplying basic needs and the purchasing capacity for food, shelter, clothing, clean water, education, and healthcare. So now to the diagrams. There's two on the left and on the right. On the left, we're looking at this. This is from Sightline Institute, by the way. It came out of a book, excellent little book called Tax Shift. And then as Sightline Institute moved from Washington, D.C. to the Pacific Northwest, they modeled for those states plus British Columbia. First, they looked at the current tax system of those states and the province, and then they made their suggestion for a tax shift. So you'll see 27% of that tax base of Washington Oregon, I think it was Idaho, and British Columbia. So 27% came from property taxes. That is higher than one would normally think. So that's good. And then the brown and white checkered areas, you had 48% coming from business, income, and sales tax. Well, here again, we need to make the distinction between businesses that create goods and services and businesses that are largely extracting rent. So businesses' income, which was shifted off of the high income people decades ago and has become essentially a wage tax in the United States, and sales taxes, which too often falls on basics in some places, like sales taxes even on food. You had a fairly high amount of existing environmental taxes in those regions, that ecotopia, if you've read Kallenbach's book, region, of existing environmental taxes of 18%, and then you had a miscellaneous. Let me see if I can see, can you see the rest of that chart? Because I actually, okay, I got to move this. All right, so their model, which has become a basis for movements for tax reform. So first we have to start with a vision. We have to understand that we're looking at taxation as an incentive system for all these good things that the Green New Deal wants to do. We're going to start with how that business and income, that big chunk, about half, 48%, is modeled as now adding on significant amounts of pollution and carbon taxes, decarbonization. Let's tax the bads. Let's tax pollution when we can find a source point for pollution. To tax is to create or destroy. Let's destroy the bad things. So let's tax pollution and carbon taxes. Traffic taxes, that certainly causes a lot of pollution. Dave Wetzel might talk about how you can use systems to decrease the amount of congestion in cities that he's helped put in place in London years ago. So traffic taxes, 5%, that's not very much, but it's significant. Might get people more on maybe public transportation, or I hear a lot of people are buying bicycles these days. Hydropower taxes. Well, you might think, well, that's a renewable resource, hydropower, but it is based on location of water, waterfalls, and there are land locations into that. So let's not have the few monopolize the hydropower points. And certainly public spending is needed even to develop the hydropower potential. Then you have something very important, and 4% I think is rather low, but it's better than nothing. Place to start is on water. And we know there's a significant amount of privatization of water right now. Those who've gotten deeply into water justice say there should be a certain amount for basic needs for household that's essentially free. And then those using above that amount would pay a resource rent for water. Timber, you have states like Alabama, that's a huge amount. I mean, like a third of the state covered with privately owned timber, paying almost no taxation. And let me say, for those who are concerned about cutting down old growth forests and so on, the use of minerals and the use of land, in my view, should be strong. I mean, the zoning and so on should strongly come from public dialogue and from participatory democracy and the people themselves deciding if certain land is to be set aside as a park or certain land can be utilized for private use. Fish, again, I mean, fish that, how do you make sure that the wild salmon that the Native Americans rely on in the Pacific Northwest, that they're a renewable resource, but somebody has to be paid to protect renewable resources even. That's a matter of public funding. Make sure the water stays clean so that the salmon can run up those streams. Make sure that there's not one company that's getting ahead of the game and getting those fish. So minerals taxes, that's a lot for just 4%, but we're looking at a model here, and any place that has enough people, enough power, can start moving this, could broaden that out to 4, 5, 6, 7, 10% or whatever. But minerals taxes we see in our United States public lands, our federal lands, massively undervalued resources that are being extracted by corporations that could significantly pay for some of the federal budget. Some of the needs that we want if we're going to do any mining on the public lands, some of those rents could surely pay to help build renewable energy. So now you have that business and income sector shrunk down to 16%. You have miscellaneous, the same as previous, 7%. You keep the existing environmental taxes. Now, most areas don't even have environmental taxes, but there is substantial experience with environmental and pollution taxes around the world. So those kind of best practices could be brought forward by us. And now, of course, an area that Georgists focus on quite highly is to convert the upside property tax that taxes our buildings, our improvements, in much higher in relative to the usually underassessed land value. And we know that there is more than enough funds to pay for needed public goods and services out of the land rent, the unearned, and that's the important distinction we make between earned income and unearned income. And you look at the big money of the 1%, that's mostly what we would call unearned income coming out of an unfair economic structure. So when we convert that property tax towards the land value, it's not theoretical. Numerous cities, towns, even implementing this to a relatively minor degree, have found that the landlords either fix up their properties. If they're boarded up buildings, they hire labor and capital and get those sites to work, or they sell off those boarded up properties to people who are what I call good working capitalists, who are able to hire labor and capital. It's usually local sourced, thus helping build the local economy, to fix up those buildings. Now, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, our state capital, had population about 50,000. It had about 5,000 boarded up buildings. As they proceeded with this land value tax shift, they brought the number of boarded up buildings down to 400. They were able to have funds for environmental improvements, parks, the arson, the rate of those setting fire to buildings went down significantly. Many, many societal improvements came out of this fundamental shift in the city of Harrisburg, but also other of our towns and cities who've moved in the direction of the property tax shifting onto land values. Our threat, if you will, is that too many think that property tax is antiquated and unfair. It is the way it's currently set up. And they want to move to local income taxes. We know that that will further shrink purchasing capacity. It will do nothing to solve the housing affordability issue. With the land values increasing faster than wages, it's the same dilemma. More people working longer and harder, causing more stress, causing more health issues, causing more weakened immune system, more vulnerability to disease, chronic disease, viruses, or so on. It causes a weakened immune system. So in ending, I just want to articulate that we can connect the dots now between an inappropriately established taxation system and what we propose to collect the land rent for the people, and our actual physical and mental health.
Thank you so much, Alanna.
There are two questions that were raised. The one question we'll deal with now was just a question about when the charts, what year the charts were made. When was this analysis performed?
It was not recent. It was maybe, it comes to me maybe 15 years ago. I don't have the book with me, but you can look up Sightline Institute and see what they're doing. I just haven't come across any better holistic charts. It's a model. So does it matter when it was put together? I'm not sure. I think that it's about 15 years ago.
Okay. The second question we'll have to wait till tomorrow because it's really for a much more in-depth response. But I'll read the question but not ask you to answer it.
All right, I'll think about it overnight.
How will the timber taxes be assessed based on usage? They will be assessed before harvesting, after sale, and who will pay for them? The producer of timber or the consumer of timber? So some thoughtful questions that I'll let you think about. So thank you, Alanna. And now, introduce Dave Wetzel a little bit again. I introduced Dave by saying, Dave, you're living in very challenging times in the United Kingdom. We have great challenges in the United States and in many countries, but none of us are living in a country that is leaving an economic union, a relationship with other countries in the way that your society is having to deal with, along with everything else, the COVID-19 virus and political party rancor, etc. So with that, I don't know if you're planning to talk about that at all depth, but we're anxious to hear from your perspective of someone in the UK.
Thanks very much, Ed. Certainly wasn't my intention to go much into Brexit, mainly because today I'm not speaking on behalf of the Green Party, although I'm a member of the Green Party. And of course, many people in the UK Green Party are not socialist, but we have a strong socialist left element within the Green Party. And the Green Party's policy in the UK was to stay in Brexit, and in fact, more recently to have a second referendum, so the first one could be overthrown. And personally, I'm a Lexiteer, a left-wing Brexiteer, and I want the UK to leave the EU. And it's interesting that we're going to be able to hopefully leave the EU without a civil war, which is what has happened in other countries when one state or another has wanted to leave. But what I'm going to be talking about is a socialist Green Deal and why the planet needs a socialist Green Deal. And particularly, I'm obviously looking at it from a UK perspective. And I base the New Deal that I promote on three principles. One is the collection of natural wealth, and we've already heard a lot about that, and I wish to add to that debate. Secondly, to use resources sparingly. We don't have a planet B, we only have this planet, and we can either waste it and destroy it, or we can use the resources that are available sparingly. And then thirdly, which is really the socialist agenda, and that is equality for all. And that's equality in terms of sharing wealth, but more importantly, to my mind, it is equality in terms of power. The working class generally are powerless, and the only time they really express their power perhaps is when they go out on strike. In Britain in the early 70s, we had a Tory government that introduced a 3-day week because the miners were on strike. and we couldn't produce enough energy. And while I'm speaking about energy on that point, it's interesting to note that during this coronavirus, because production is down in the UK in April, our production was down by 20% of the GDP. But because of that, we now hear birds singing in our towns and our cities. And for the last 2 months, we've not had to use coal at all in any of our power stations to produce the energy we need. And that, to my mind and to many others, is a clear indication for the future where we should be going. But why do I say a socialist Green Deal? I think this is a unique time. The coronavirus and the effect it's had here in the UK has meant that most people now recognise how fragile our existence is on this planet. I don't suppose there's many people in the UK who haven't lost a friend because of the coronavirus. Certainly our land value tax movement lost a valuable friend when the chair of the Coalition for Economic Justice died from two things. One, he was being treated for cancer, Peter Bowman, and secondly, on his death certificate, is the coronavirus. And he wasn't as old as me. He was in his 60s. I'm in my late 70s. People now recognise, or are beginning to recognise here, that the coronavirus is hitting the poorest hardest. More poorer people are dying, and the rich are more able to actually safeguard themselves in many different ways. And we had a huge scandal over here where Boris Johnson, the man who sacked me back in 1908 when he became Mayor of London, he has a principal advisor who actually broke all the rules for the coronavirus. He left his office, spoke to his wife, who he thought had the symptoms, went back to the office, which is the worst thing you should do, and then drove over 200 miles to live in a farmhouse on his father's farm estate. And we were told that we shouldn't be making these long unnecessary journeys. And then his child had symptoms, and they took the child to the local hospital, which again, you're told you're not supposed to do. And on his wife's birthday, which happened to be Easter Sunday, they drove out to a beauty spot, allegedly testing his eyesight to see if he was safe to drive back to London. But they sat by a river and again, breaking all the rules of the coronavirus lockdown that exists in this country. And so it's a rule for the rich and a different rule for the poor. And I'm lucky. I'm sitting out in my garden now, and I have quite a nice garden with plenty of bushes and trees and birds singing. And it's not a bad place to be locked in during the coronavirus problem. But I feel very strongly about the people who are in flats and people who are in accommodation that they don't have a garden and therefore are not able to survive in the pleasant way that I've been able to survive while I've been isolating. Well, our family have isolated ourselves. And I think that people's realization about the disparity between how it's hitting the rich and how it's hitting the poor is a major step towards the sort of changes that we all want to see, and certainly towards the changes that as a socialist, I personally want to see. One of the major effects, dramatic effects, is to see people caring for each other. A lady on this street who, when we go shopping, we knock on her door, stand 6 feet away and say, "Do you need any shopping?" She says, "It's marvellous," she says. I've had more neighbours and got to know more neighbours since the coronavirus than I did before. People are coming out of their little isolated shells and helping each other. And I've heard many stories, some through the Green Party, other through family and friends, of people who have made great changes to their own life just in order to be able to help other people. Not to make a quick dime, not to make a profit, not to get any personal benefit, but just to be caring and sharing with other people. And some of those sacrifices have been really great, and I admire the people that have been able to do that and have been doing it. And I think as a result of that, people are recognizing that we can't beat the coronavirus through the old selfish capitalist ways. We do all have to work together, despite what President says. I want to see us all working together, not just in our local communities, not just in our regions, not just in our nations, but internationally. I want to see a stronger World Health Organization, and I want to see more people cooperating for all these scientific things that need to be done. Don't let's just try and compete with each other. So the first company that comes up with some sort of antibiotic I know it's not an antibiotic for a virus, but whatever it's called, can actually make more profits than the company down the road or the company overseas. I want to see companies working together to actually beat this thing, because it is something that threatens all of us. And if people are recognizing that the old immoral capitalist methods based on greed and competition are not working, they're going to be looking for a new way of working. And I believe that new way of working has to be socialism, and preferably, in my book, green socialism. In Britain, they've been talking a lot about the Second World War. In 1940, Britain stood alone, and it would have been very easy for us just to have done a deal with Nazi Germany, and indeed many of the Tory politicians actually wanted to do that. It would have been seen as a safe, soft option. But Britain chose not to do that, and it chose to fight alone. And I've just been reading a book about Churchill and the efforts he went to keep friendly with the American government and to talk about an Atlantic alliance. And it is those sort of alliances that we need, not to allow one country to rule over another or one group of countries to rule over another, but for us all to work together cooperatively in the common good. And cooperative is the main word I choose for socialism. To me, cooperativism and socialism are sides of the same, different sides of the same coin. And we need government action. People realise that you can't beat the coronavirus as individuals. You do need government action. You need government action in terms of preparing the country, and government action into funding science, government action in funding industry. We have a layoff scheme where people get 20% of their wages deducted, but 80% are paid by the government in order to keep them employed sitting at home. And that is government action. And it's good government action that people need. And it is good government action that we will need if we're going to battle that other great big threat on the planet, and that threat is, of course, climate change and pollution. We need to combat those, and we can't combat them as individuals. We'll need to do the same thing as happened with the coronavirus. We will need government action, and we need a government that is prepared and able to do that. In the same way as we had government action during a war, and any country facing war needs government action. I'd rather we didn't have any wars. That's why I'm wearing my T-shirt, which is against the arms trade. But I recognise that at times of great stress, people do need government action. And government action, to me, reads socialist action. So we have the resources we need to put the planet on a war footing. We have the people that could put the planet on a war footing. Now we need the political action to put the planet on a war footing to beat climate change and to beat pollution. People in the UK have been coming out 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening and clapping, literally clapping. And those aren't just people in their local streets, but we've had royalty, we've had celebrities, and we've had politicians all coming out 8 o'clock on a Thursday night clapping. And what are they clapping for? They're not clapping themselves, they're clapping the NHS workers, that is the National Health Service workers, and the care workers in old people's homes and other care settings, applauding them for the dangerous work they've been doing, and many of them have died. And that spirit of people actually coming out and clapping, the spirit of an old man walking around his garden. He was 99 years old, and on his 100th birthday, he wanted to collect £1,000 for the National Health Service. It really drew the attention of the country, and he ended up actually collecting over £30 million for the National Health Service. One man with a Zimmer frame walking around his garden 100 times. And it was quite a good sized garden, I hasten to add. It wasn't an easy walk for him. But that spirit, people wanted to be involved. They wanted to push him along with their money. And I think people are prepared to actually see the sort of changes that our two previous speakers have been talking about. And we know that workers create all wealth. Wealth is not created other than labour, human labour, being devoted or utilising natural resources. That's how we create the wealth. And if we're all involved in creating the wealth, then surely we should all be involved in sharing that wealth. The coronavirus has shown it's highlighted and shown the deficiencies of capitalism in my country. And it is now an opportunity for us to harness this new spirit. I'm in a bit of a thunderstorm here. Can you all still hear me okay? Or should I move indoors? Are we okay?
There's a little bit of background noise, but we can still hear you.
Okay, I'll carry on. So the most important thing that I think we can harness this new community spirit to is the spirit of sharing our natural resources. And we need to build a new economy, as the two previous speakers have been talking about, a new economy based on sharing our natural resources. What is more obvious? The stuff that nature provides should be shared by all. This morning in this garden, I was speaking at 6 foot distance to my two granddaughters, and I was explaining to them how landowners in the past in the UK were able just to put fences around common land, around forests, and declared it as their own.
It's getting pretty bad now, so if you can move indoors and get away from the rain coming down, that'd be helpful.
Okay, sit with me. I'll be 2 seconds.
Okay. Okay. We'll stay here and wait for you to get safe.
I need the help of my missus.
Okay.
Can't hear myself speak.
Not very many questions have been posted. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function.
Yes, I will, please. there we are. Hopefully now we're behind the soundproofing. And we pick up on this point that to eradicate poverty on our planet, we need to share the planet's resources. My two granddaughters were quite outraged at the thoughts that all land came from theft. All ownership of land came from theft. It was a concept they've heard me talk about land value tax, but we hadn't talked about these fundamental issues before. And it was only a 10-minute, 15-minute conversation, but I think it gives us an opportunity to speak and an opportunity to have these conversations. And my second major point was about eliminating waste. We do live in a wasteful society. I think of plastics floating in the sea. I think of energy being wasted. I think of the system of land ownership encouraging people to speculate and to waste their use of our natural resource. It isn't possible that we can continue on this basis. We've got to start making things to last instead of inbuilt obsolescence, because it suits the capitalist system to keep making new cars and eliminating the old cars. Let's make cars that will last longer. Let's make all our goods that should be made last longer, so we don't have to change every year. My wife and I, we had an old washing machine we inherited from our mother. And when we bought a new washing machine, we gave it to a friend's daughter, and she was using it for many years. It lasted about 35 years, but that was a washing machine that was built in the 1950s. And today, you'd never get a washing machine last that sort of length of time, and there's no reason why that could not be the case. And we don't need to keep destroying and recycling our natural resources. Let's start building things that are going to last. And of course, when we think about waste, we're also thinking about energy and the need to insulate our homes and to insulate the places where we work. All our buildings could be better insulated. That would be a huge job creation for the green agenda. You know, many trade unionists, they worry about not having a market, not having an economy where you keep producing more and more stuff. To them, they see that as jobs. I don't see it as jobs. To me, those sort of jobs are like employing people to dig a hole and then employing them the next week to fill the hole in and go on and so on and so on. We don't need to do that. We need to actually use our materials and use our scarce labour far better. I think it's better to employ people doing the sort of social care things that have been going on during the coronavirus. Why shouldn't we be paying people to do these things? And I agree with the ideas that Alanna was quoting about Alaska and us having a land dividend to share with everybody on the planet, for them to choose for themselves how they will spend their share of the land dividend. I also see that as a way of locking in any economic changes we make. In the UK, we talk about land value tax, and we don't want the Tories to run an election where they say, well, let's give the land value after, let's assume land value tax has been introduced. We don't want a system whereby they run a successful election where they say, let's give the land value back to the Duke of Westminster. And I think a good way of locking in the collection of land value for the public purse is for a percentage of it. I would suggest a third, but it could be a different percentage, to go to every person, every man, woman and child in the country as a land dividend. And then when the Tories come along and say, right, we want to give that money back to the Duke of Westminster, people say, hey, no, we're not going to lose our land dividend, we need it. And so therefore I see a land dividend as an important component for the sharing economy. And interestingly, it's one that not all socialists agree on, because many socialists think only the state can decide how money should be spent. Whereas I have great faith in people and their ability to share the wealth wisely. The collecting rent of land and natural resources will in itself eliminate a lot of waste. The waste we see of empty sites in towns and cities, sites that could be productive. In the 1980s, I visited the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union. And I saw a factory in Minsk making tractors. And that factory stretched from the outskirts of town right into the center of town, like a huge wedge of cheese on that city of Minsk. And when we visited it, I saw that there was loads of space between the different workshops, the laboratories and what have you. But they just wasted the space that they had available. And in a discussion group, I asked the factory manager, how much rent do you pay for the land? And his reply was, well, you've got to understand, this is the Soviet Union. We don't have private ownership of land. We don't pay rent for land. And my retort to that was, well, that explains to me why you're wasting it. Because if you imagine he was paying rent for the land, he would have consolidated his factory onto one smaller site, releasing a load of land for other activities. Our tourist hotel was on the outskirts of town next to a forest. Well, you don't normally build a tourist hotel on the outskirts of town next to a forest. But that was the reality of their misuse of land rent. And what happened in Moscow when I visited Moscow and started asking questions how flats got allocated, they weren't allocated on price, but they were allocated whether or not you were in favour with the officials that provided the space. And you could do all sorts of things, bribery, voting for them in the Communist Party meetings, all sorts of activities in order to make sure you were top of the queue for a flat that didn't require a 3/4 of an hour or 2-hour journey on a bus or a tram to get to work. You wanted one closer to the centre of town. So by actually getting rid of the unnecessary idle sites, we'd have more sites that we could actually use for green spaces in our towns and cities. And I'm very much in favour of having urban farms. I started one when I was leader here at Hounslow Council back in the 1980s. I was told it was going to be Wetzel's white elephant, but not during the coronavirus, but we, normal times, still get grannies and granddads taking their grandchildren to our urban farm, and they use it to breed all sorts of rare breed animals, pigs and all sorts that used to be bred in this country are now being bred in our urban farm. So I want to see more of that, and I believe with a land value tax, collecting the rent of land, we can achieve that. And we avoid the unnecessary urban sprawl. We avoid people travelling long distances in order to get to work. We have bus drivers in London that can't afford to buy a house in London, so they commute for an hour's drive to get to work and an hour's drive to get home again. So instead of driving a bus for 8 hours, they're driving a vehicle for 10 hours a day. And that is bad for the economy, it's bad for the individuals, it's bad for their families. And I believe that a land value tax, giving us more compact towns and cities, less urban sprawl, will actually make a huge difference to the economy and also to our society. I want to see the taxation of waste. I think it was Bill Butt I saw years ago wearing a badge saying, tax bads, not goods. And I want to see the taxation of waste, people do react in this country. Just 5p on a supermarket plastic bag has reduced the production of plastic bags enormously. And it's only the major supermarkets, the small shops still give them out. I would like to see everybody having to pay that 5p, whatever type of shop they go into. And as I already said, the coronavirus has shown us how clean our cities could be. We can now breathe the air in our cities, and that is encouraging people to cycle and people to walk. Heather and I have done far more walking since we've had the lockdown. We're allowed out for an hour every day, and we've made use of that. And it's nice to be able to walk without being heavily polluted. We actually moved to where we are now, which is still in London, but slightly less polluting, because where we lived for the last 20 years, we were all getting asthma. And we need to have cleaner cities, less pollution, and car pollution is one of the main things. One of the things towards that I would like to see is freight tubes used to get rid of our lorries off the roads. Not all of them. Local journeys will still be made door to door by vehicle, hopefully by an electric vehicle. But lorries, I understand, 92% of the energy used by a lorry doesn't shift the freight. Only 8% of the energy used actually shifts the freight. 92% shifts the lorry, shifts the gearbox, the engine, the chassis, the fuel tank. It shifts the fuel inside the fuel tank. It shifts the driver. It's a waste of energy. And pipeline technology is well developed. We use pipelines for sewerage. We use it for fresh water, tap water. We use pipelines for oil. We use pipelines for all sorts of gas, all sorts of things. The technology is there. And we could have pipelines running city to city, carrying our goods in containers, cylindrical containers, a meter diameter, carrying half what a container would normally take, a shipping container, and much a fraction of the cost. A container from Glasgow to London would only cost about £10, whereas to actually shift a container full of gear costs much more than that, many times that today. So I think we need to be able to look at new ideas. And when I talk to transport planners about this, they think I'm balmy. But I remind them that when a solicitor 160 years ago was suggesting that London should have an underground passenger railway, people thought he was balmy. And it took him 20 years before the first underground railway was built here in London. And maybe in 20 years' time, I'll see freight tubes operating, helping us to have a cleaner society.
Dave, I'm gonna bring your presentation to an end unless you have something really important you want to add, so that we can get to some of the questions that have been put on the board, and I'm sure there'll be others. Do you have any final comment to make?
Final point. It is people that create wealth, and I believe it's people that should share that wealth. I want directors to have a legal duty in this country. Their legal duty is to their shareholders only. I want to see them have a legal duty to their customers, a legal duty to their workforce, and a legal duty to their local community. I want them to have a legal duty to the environment, so that we change the whole ethos of capitalism. It becomes something totally different. And I want to see us in a world where no child is left uneducated, a world where no child is left needing a health service, and no child is left without food. I believe in a world of love. I want to see us build an economy and a society based on love and caring.
How could one argue against any of those thoughts? I mean, that's really, what we all hope for. and what we've been discussing so far are various means to get us there. I just have one question of sort of a clarification question that came up for you, Dave. And this came from Alan, and he asks, where are you living in the UK? Where is your beautiful home? And congratulations on your garden.
It's a very small garden. We've just made it a bit bigger. Our next door neighbour had a fire in his shed, and it spread to our 16-foot shed. So that's been eliminated. We had 2 fire engines come. This was only about 4 weeks ago, well, less than 4 weeks ago. So the garden has grown in the last couple of weeks. But the answer is I live in West London. I live on the flight path at Heathrow Airport. The area itself is called Hamworth. It's a part of Feltham. And our main reason for moving here was because our eldest daughter lives around the corner. There's 6 of us as adults all living in this house. And there's her with her 2 daughters living around the corner. So we're now one big happy family. But West London, I was born in West London. I was born 6 miles down the road in the State Hospital. And I think West London's one of the most beautiful parts of the world to live.
I hope that satisfies Alan. Quite a few questions are put on here from Giannis. I'm going to just pick out one that I think is a good one to for all 3 of you to comment on based on your presentations. He asks early on, he talks about repatriation of offshore jobs. He mentions this in specific reference to national health, but I think in general the question is important in terms of public policy, domestic government policy, and that is should domestic government policy favor the repatriation of jobs that have been sent offshore? Is that an appropriate, policy that is consistent with a societal objective? What do you think?
I'm with Henry George on this as a free trader, and I think each economy should do what it can do most efficiently and what it can do best. You may have heard of the Dyson vacuum cleaner. They used to be manufactured in this country. They were invented in this country by a man called Dyson. And he now manufactures his vacuum cleaners in Malaya. But he now employs more people on technology, design and experimenting and coming up with new ideas than he employed in his old small factory in Dorset. And I think that's the way to go. This economy, we're well educated, we can provide the designers. My problem with capitalism is that we got people coming out of university, engineers, designers, architects who are unemployed. They can't get the jobs. And if they do get a job, very often it's a low-paid, unskilled job, working serving coffee or something like that, instead of using the skills they've been trained for. So I'm all in favour of each economy doing what it can do best. And I'm not in favour of us saying, well, we have to have basic manufacturing jobs. I worked for the first 3 years of my working life. I worked in a factory, and I can tell you, manufacturing jobs in a factory can be pretty boring and pretty
Mind-numbing.
Yeah, numbing's the word. I knew some middle-class person would have the right word. I'm just a working-class lad from the factory.
Well, Marty, Alanna, any thoughts on the question that Giannis raised? Alanna, you're muted.
Considering the rule by the 1% and the corporate rule system that we're under, corporations rule the world, as David Corton wrote in his book. Who's made the decisions to take our jobs to China? It's based on the profit motive. Who takes the jobs out of the United States? It's companies that have the capital to do so and the capacity, because they can remove the capital to China or maybe India or elsewhere. And they go in search of low wages. They go around the world to exploit labor compared to what they would have to pay in developed countries. So we don't need to force them to do one thing or the other. We need to get our own incentives right here in the United States with the capacity that we have to do so. Again, see the power of taxation. If we're not taxing labor and capital, productive capital and labor, and if we say, hey, look, people, how can you localize your economy? How you can go local to produce most of the things that are produced elsewhere, then we can get the incentives right. The corporations that have more land than they're really using will either pay a fair share for that or give it up for other people to afford access to land. So the reason that the Chinese people might work for lower wages also has to do with the land problem, because they have had until recently, I guess, or until the city centers. But listen, a less developed country has lower land rents. Lower land rents means lower housing costs, meaning that a worker can provision themselves with basic necessities that they basically need to survive to work. They can do that at a lower cost than workers in countries where there's high land value. So just as corporations, real estate investors will look worldwide to where they can make a killing in real estate, capture the land and the land rent, corporations will look worldwide to see where they can advantageously pay labor less. And since labor cost relates to land costs, that's how you get that mechanism operative. That incentive is there because of that. Does that make sense? Or no?
I'm reminded of what Henry George ended his book Protection or Free Trade with. And I think this is how I would summarize what you said. And that is, without the public collection of land rent, free trade will not achieve the results that free trade advocates believe it will achieve. So it's got to be done in tandem with solving the land question.
Yeah.
Marty, is that?
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's the idea of the primary wrong. And sometimes we go down these alleyways trying to, well, we can't get the land value tax, so let's go all these secondary ways. And so then we get confused and decades get lost. And well, anyway, so I wanted to point out two things. And I think on the Dyson example, if the government would say, okay, that's okay to do, to send the manufacturing jobs, as long as the number of jobs domestically stay the same or increase, with the idea that sounds like what David is talking about is the concept of increasing returns, where you look at high technology or optimizing your manufacturing process so that what stays domestically is good. But just to ship wholesale jobs to China and other countries is really poor policy for the nation, because what's most important is that there are jobs that generate the income that can get taxed, land values or whatever people have to keep the economy going. So I think sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot trying to look at prices when our next door neighbor could be working if we would pay maybe a few cents more for things. The other thing that happened in the COVID situation is that we're finding that a lot of the things that we should have been working on were being produced overseas, and either they need what we needed, or they weren't producing enough. So there's a time when you look at efficiencies and of that sort and say, well, what's our primary objective? Well, the objective is to to be immune or resilient to deficiencies like ventilators or drugs or those kind of things. There has to be a domestic production, and that's really the point I was trying to make with maybe the best policy for going forward is to revamp the old Rust Belt and get it back into a high technology mode. And but those are the two responses to Yanni's question about repatriating jobs overseas. I think in general it's bad policy to just willy-nilly just send jobs because you're going to save a few cents when your neighbor has lost his job because of doing that.
An important point I heard from Dave, and I hope I'm paraphrasing you correctly, Dave, is that we need laws and regulations that expand the responsibility for people who are engaged in business. They have to be members of a community. They have to not be just devoted to maximizing profits for shareholders, but to meeting obligations to the people in their community, to their employees and others. And if we have those laws in a society, then the problem of sending jobs out of the country to maximize profit may be mitigated by these other considerations. Is that fair, Dave?
Very much so. If you consider who actually has a bigger stake in a factory, is it the person who spent maybe 0.1% of their total investment portfolio on buying shares in that factory yesterday, in the company that owns the factory yesterday, or is it the worker who's been sweeping the factory floor for the last 30 years? I would suggest the worker who's been sweeping the factory floor for 30 years has a much bigger stake and has a right to a bigger say than the person who just happened to buy a small fraction of their investment into that factory yesterday. As the law stands, the investor has all the consideration, and the guy, person, woman, man sweeping the factory floor has no consideration whatsoever.
Okay, let me move to a question that was raised by Mark and Asamu. This is addressed to all three of you. Politics in the United States has become quite futile, and we are sliding into incompetent and oligarchic dictatorship that represents only the 1%. What is the strategy to build a political movement in support of our shared policies and vision? And if you can answer that in a couple days, that would be great. Anyone want to take that on?
I need you to repeat the question.
Okay, I'll read it again. Politics in the United States has become quite futile, and we are sliding into incompetent and oligarchic dictatorship that represents only the 1%. What is the strategy to build a political movement in support of our shared policies and vision?
I could start off, if you will. I am also influenced by a political economic philosophy and practice that came out of India some time ago called progressive utilization theory. That's a big mouthful, but what it means is that the use of the materials should be for true progress, which is the mental and spiritual expansion of the human being. And I believe that's what Henry George was all about. He wanted a society where basic needs were well met so that human being could expand and all the higher qualities of being a human being. Prout states that the most difficult shift to make is out of the monopoly capitalist psychology. And that psychology is extremely vicious. It's being so profit-oriented, very narrow in that focus, and very clever and very cunning. And that psychology likes to keep the people divided in many ways. The culture wars, the right-left divide, the division is what keeps them moving their power ahead, stronger and stronger to consolidating more wealth and control. So this crisis that we are in is going to lead to increasing violence in the United States and elsewhere, as we're already seeing horrific violence now, until and unless we have enough of the values-oriented thinkers or intellectuals, those not sold out, working for the monopoly capitalists, people like us who are values-oriented intellectuals, and the military people who question who has the authority and begin to align themselves with the people's movements. The people's movements need to be guided by a very clear vision of principles and policies to say yes to. Right now, the violence in the streets, you're hearing what they don't want. We know what people don't want. But the unified clarity of vision for what we want to create and what we want to build and how to get there is on our shoulders as values-oriented intellectuals that have a brilliant, bright idea for solving many social problems. I would like us to be in discussion. I would love to walk into a conference or a Zoom conference and see military people and police in uniform in dialogue with us, because they have the moral, we need the moral courage all around to step forward and to unite and to have the force of those who are set up to protect and serve the people, for them to come forward and work with us.
Yeah, there's Marty. Yeah, I think there was a good question about how to look at the political movement. So what I see was that there was a fantastic mobilization of youth before the pandemic behind Bernie. And whether you agree with everything Bernie was saying or not, it was impressive the amount of energy there was. And I think, unfortunately, the pandemic and other things kind of dashed his hopes. And then we saw the Democratic Party, leaning toward somebody like Joe Biden. So when you look at the Democratic Party and the two leading parties, by and large, they're still neoliberal and going for, looking at the private interests. One talks one way and the other one talks another way, but essentially it's the same policy. So I think that's one thing in terms of the, going after the effort for the 1%. But I think that, we've got not only the Bernie movement that went up, and it's somewhat kind of hard to say where it's at now, but now the Black Lives Matter seems to have an increase, and whether that's going to translate into a political, we really don't know whether that's going to go into electoral politics. But I think what the answer to the question, I think that it's a crime that if there's any race or any primary where somebody that we know is not on the ballot, no matter how competent that person is, I think we need to be a force as a Georgist organization or council to be there as a resource so that anybody who runs, they can tap us. And because if you're not on the ballot, you're not going to get elected. And if you're not elected, you're not going to have a say in how things go. So I think it's encouraging in the UK, where you have the Green Party and other parties getting a sizable vote. The more people we have saying the things that we know that are true, that's the better that we're going to move that direction.
As I understand the question, it's suggested that we now have governments that are only looking after the 1%. Well, my answer would be, hasn't it always been like that? When Henry George stood to be mayor of New York, wasn't it? The Tammany Hall politics that beat him. It wasn't the ideas. He was winning on the ideas, but it was this fact that rich people rule the ballot, and they do it in subtle ways, sometimes not such subtle ways. But after years of campaigning, my first election was when I was 21, and I've stood in many, many elections, about 15 elections for public office since, and I didn't win them all by any means. But you get on the doorstep a repetition of what's being said in the capitalist press. I remember one election where we had a Labour government, and one of the Labour ministers owned 5 houses. And almost every other door, I was told, what, vote for you? And you socialists got 5 houses. Another time was when there was Scargill and the miners' strike. Scargill was the miners' leader. And every other doorstep was saying, oh, I can't stand for Mr. Scargill, I'm not voting for you. And that was when Thatcher was around and winning elections. And Tony Benn was a lovely man. I knew him personally, a brilliant socialist. And he was demonized by the press. And they do it by sort of getting photos where your eyes are like that in the photo. And people think, well, that's your normal look. You go around looking like that all the time. But of course, when you're making a speech, you do these gestures. And it only takes one clever photographer to sell it for £40,000 for everybody to assume that you're a nutcase. So, and then they put the royalty and all that, unless that particular member of the royal family's out of favour, they put the royalty in the best light. So we're all being brainwashed by the media, but it's not a new phenomenon. I think it's been going on since, well, even before we all had to vote. Obviously, the ruling class ruled in their own benefit. The Magna Carta wasn't a charter for working people. It was a charter for the rich barons. And the main purpose was that they wouldn't have to continue paying their rent for their lands to the king. But nowadays, we're taught at school that Magna Carta was wonderful. It gave us habeas corpus, and it did, but it wasn't the main purpose. The main purpose was that the barons wouldn't have to pay their rent for their lands. And I'm trying to reverse Magna Carta.
Well, I think, we're almost at the end of our time for today, but certainly we've built up a lot of momentum for a robust discussion of some really important issues tomorrow. I'll basically end by just making an observation, build on what was just said about elections. I've been doing a lot of research into the early history of the single tax movement. And in the Single Tax Review, which was published from 1901 until 1923, there's an ongoing story, month to month, issue to issue, about to what extent single taxers should be directly involved in political parties or start their own political party. And there was never any real strong agreement. Henry George is quoted as saying, and I don't remember where this comes from, that the single tax will be implemented indirectly rather than directly by political action. And yet he stood for candidacy of mayor of New York City with, I guess, the hope that he might be able to introduce it in New York and start a best practice. So we've had over a century of this debate and the same struggle. And here we are in 2020, and we're trying to figure out, how do we get it done? How do we change human behavior? Or at least, how do we get enough people ready to think about how they behave and how the system gives them incentives that are destructive to the cooperative behavior that Dave is talking about? For me, the term has always been cooperative individualism, but cooperative behavior within a within a society that looks after the interests of every individual, whether or not one wants to call that democratic socialism or social democracy. These are issues that we've faced and continue to face, and I don't know if we've made a major contribution to the discussion today, but at least we've informed some people that there are some options that need to be considered as we move forward, and maybe it'll affect the work that we're able to do in the next coming year and give us some motivation. So with that, I thank the three of you for great presentations and for your response to the questions. And tomorrow we'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. The way I perceive this is I've been taking notes about your talks. I will put some questions directly to you to respond to, and then we'll have a general conversation where you can ask each other questions, and then we'll open it up to our attendees. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dan to close out the day.
Okay, I like this quite a bit. I think the conservative Georgists are not going to agree or not going to disagree much with the core proposals of the progressive Georgists. I think whatever disagreement will be over will be with some of the politics and some of the things that were very ancillary to the main point anyhow. And I wanted to note that, you know, you should have tomorrow's, this was a mistake, but now that we've made it, we have to stick with it. I'm pretty sure that tomorrow's Zoom codes are different from today's Zoom codes. Tomorrow's Zoom codes are all the Sunday events have the same Zoom code, and so so tomorrow's Zoom code will follow that standard Zoom code.
Will you send out the Zoom codes to everyone so they know?
Yes, they're already scheduled to be sent out. They are also on our website, www.cgocouncil.org. So they are there.
Okay, thank you, Sue.
And I guess that's it. I think it was a very good presentation. And,
we have to thank our donors.
Sue, I know what I'm doing.
So Dan, I had a question. The questions that were posted today, are they still going to be on the Zoom page tomorrow?
I just copied them to my notebook, so I can. I
did the same thing. I just want.
Yeah, I can give them to Ed, or he can copy it too.
Okay.
And then we can start off with those questions and add any additional questions that arise.
No, you did a good job. Thanks.
And can I thank you guys for organising this and thank the audience for listening. And it was much easier for me to do this than try swimming across the ditch.
Used to call it a pond. Now it's a ditch.
There's no swimming during the quarantine. So. Okay, and so I guess we're done. Did anybody else have any final remarks? Well, then I will switch to the, let's see, is this the right one?
Bye, thank you.
Thanks. So once again, these presentations were made possible by the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation primarily, and also by the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, and personal donors. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Dan. Bye, everyone.
Great job. Thanks.